Every bubble in history has one thing in common. Right up until the moment it pops, almost nobody in the room is willing to call it a bubble. Not the experts, not the institutions, not even the people quietly moving their own money out the back door while telling everyone else to stay in. Today we're talking about the pattern that keeps repeating, decade after decade, market after market, and why even now almost nobody wants to say the word bubble out loud. Let's start with what a bubble actually is, because the word gets thrown around so much it's basically lost its meaning. A bubble isn't just prices going up. Prices go up for good reasons all the time: growth, demand, innovation. A bubble is specifically when the price of something detaches from what it's actually worth and keeps climbing anyway because people aren't buying it for what it does. They're buying it because the price went up yesterday and they assume it'll go up again tomorrow. At that point, the asset stops being an asset. It becomes a story. And stories can run for a surprisingly long time before anyone checks whether they're true. Here's the part that should bother you. Every single bubble in modern history had smart, credentialed, experienced people defending it right up until the collapse. Not idiots, not outsiders, the actual experts. In the late 1920s, top economists were going on record saying stocks had reached a permanent plateau of prosperity. Weeks later, the market lost almost 90% of its value. In the late 1990s, respected analysts were writing that traditional valuation metrics simply didn't apply to internet companies anymore, that this time the old rules were obsolete. Then hundreds of companies with no profits and no plan to ever have profits went to zero. In the mid 2000s, regulators and bank executives insisted that a nationwide housing collapse was essentially impossible because housing prices had never fallen everywhere at once. Then they did. Notice the pattern. It's never, "this is definitely a bubble and we're ignoring it." It's always some version of, "this time is different." That phrase alone should be a warning sign because it shows up right before almost every major collapse in financial history. So, why does this keep happening? Why do smart people keep getting fooled by the same pattern? First, bubbles feel amazing while they're inflating. Nobody wants to be the person calling the top while everyone around them is getting richer. If you sound the alarm too early, you just look wrong for years, while your neighbor buys a boat with gains you warned him not to chase. Being early and being wrong look identical in real time. That's a brutal position to be in publicly. Second, an entire industry gets built on top of every bubble, and that industry has zero incentive to say stop. Fund managers get paid fees based on assets under management, not on being right. Analysts at banks that are underwriting deals in a hot sector aren't exactly rewarded for publishing a report titled, "This is Fake." Media outlets get enormous traffic from exciting, rising markets, and basically none from someone calmly saying, "Please be careful." Everyone downstream of a bubble is financially better off if it keeps inflating, at least for a while. Third, bubbles almost always attach themselves to something that's genuinely real. That's actually the sneaky part. The internet was real. It did change everything. Housing is real. People do need somewhere to live. The underlying technology or asset isn't the lie. The lie is the price, and how disconnected it's gotten from any reasonable version of reality. That's what makes bubbles so hard to spot from the inside. There's always a true story buried somewhere under the inflated one. Now, here's the question nobody really wants to sit with. If every bubble in history looked obvious in hindsight and felt completely reasonable while it was happening, how would you actually know you're inside one right now? There's no perfect answer, but there are a few recurring warning signs worth paying attention to. 1. When valuation stops being part of the conversation. When people are buying something purely because it's going up and get visibly annoyed if you ask what it's actually worth or how it makes money, that's usually not a great sign. 2. When leverage quietly creeps into the picture. Bubbles rarely pop just because prices got too high. They pop because too many people borrowed money to chase those prices, and the moment things reverse, they're forced to sell at the worst possible time, which accelerates the fall. 3. when the explanation for why prices keep rising becomes increasingly abstract. It's a store of value. It's the future of the internet. This sector is uninvestable using old metrics. The vaguer and more philosophical the justification gets, the more it's worth asking whether anyone can actually explain it in plain terms. And 4. When literally everyone you know, including people who have never invested in anything in their life, suddenly has an opinion on this one specific asset. That's not proof of a bubble on its own. But historically, it's shown up right before some of the biggest ones. None of this means every rising asset is secretly a bubble in disguise. Most of the time, price going up just means price going up. That's how markets are supposed to work. But here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of this. Bubbles aren't identified by evidence. They're identified by consensus after the fact. While it's happening, calling something a bubble makes you the outsider. Afterward, everyone remembers it as obvious. That gap between what's obvious in hindsight and what's socially acceptable to say out loud in real time is exactly where every bubble in history has managed to hide. So maybe the real question isn't, is there a bubble right now? Maybe it's simpler than that. What's the one thing in this exact moment that everyone around you agrees is completely reasonable to believe that you'd feel a little embarrassed questioning out loud? History suggests that's usually where you should be looking.